All right, so the harness will have the tinned ends, and the xt90 male connector will have tinned solder cups. And what you want to do is to keep it together, inserted with the extra female. So this is the same connector that is on the battery pack itself, but you don't want to solder anywhere near a live battery, and so that's why an extra is included. And you keep those together. This is in a jig. I'll have a link to this jig. It's not very expensive, but it holds different connectors. But you keep these plugged in so that way while you're soldering, the heat doesn't deform the area of the plastic that holds the pins. And so that is very helpful. I use a helping hands thing just to brace it, makes it easier. I can aim my fume extractor, and I do recommend a cartridge-based soldering iron, or in this case a station, simply because they end up doing better with heat transfer, and you don't have to use as high a temperature to get the same results. I use this. I'll also link to this flux. Flux is very important. Without it, you get bad joints, even though most solder has rosin core or flux core. Having a dedicated source of flux is good, and it just makes the joints happen more easily, more quickly, and the joints are much more solid. And so first step is really to just thread the harness through, because all of the connectors are small enough to go through the M20 cable gland, whether that's the xt30 from the charge circuit or a JST for CAN bus. In this case, it's just the charge and discharge, but everything fits through. And then you have the heat shrunk portion. And don't cinch this down. You want to just thread all the way through, so you have all this loose cable, so that way you have room to work with, and that should be fine. So it's 12 gauge into an xt90. It's not that bad. So we're just going to get a little bit of flux. The wires are pre-tinned, however, still, actually, before we do the flux, this is the shroud. This is the part that covers over either barrel, so you don't need heat shrink, and so you always do that first. It just goes over on the wires, just like that, and then when you're done, we'll clip into the xt90 connector. So there we go. And we'll have to do this around the camera, but just a bit of flux on the wires. And since everything is tinned, you don't really need to add a whole bunch, but I do always tin the iron. So make sure your iron is clean and tinned. That way you get your joints. I'm not going to turn the fume extractor on because it's too loud, but really you just have to sort of focus up on it. A little bit more solder on there. And then you should see the whole thing start to melt. Make sure it's aligned properly, and then that should be it. If the joint looks a little bit loose, meaning you don't have a nice pool around the wire, you can redo it. Make sure it's seated properly. In this case, you might want gloves to keep your fingers from getting burned, which I will actually get. I often forget, but this is helpful. And this is hard to see with a camera in the way. I can't see it at all. And so, gotta give it one more go. You don't want to do this a lot. This would have been done already if the camera were not there, but there we go. And seated. That's better. That's a good joint. Okay. So that's the negative, and black is negative, red is positive, and the xt90s have a marking on either side. So the curved portion has a negative marking, and the flat portion has the positive marking, and so that's very clear to see. Polarity is important, and so that is that. And so we flip it over. You can also look online. You can Google search what a good solder cup joint looks like. There's a lot of very old informational videos on it on YouTube as well that are very, very good, and they give very clear examples of what proper joints look like when the parts are wetted properly, where everything is not a cold joint. This is all stuff that's available and very much worth looking at. So, okay, should be a little easier now that I'm actually wearing the glove and I won't get burned immediately. Here we go. Clean the iron. There we go. So, move this. I usually let this cool before I take the connector out and then push the housing back on. But once you're certain that these joints are good and they're solid and they look and feel fine, then let it cool, disconnect this, and then you can press the housing into there, and then you can go ahead and thread this back out, and then with everything that you need to be in there just to gauge the distance, you can then set the distance there, cinch down the cable gland nut, and then you should be good to go.